The title Naturalizing Modal Epistemology is blatantly stolen from a paper by Daniel Nolan, which I'll start with to give you an idea, and also not to take credit where credit belongs to Daniel. So Daniel Nolan has written a programmatic and I think excellent paper called Naturalized Modal Epistemology, in which he says the following. He says, I advocate an investigation of what we're already doing when we think we are modalizing well, to see if we can articulate what is good about successful modal inquiry. Then we should do more of that, together with any improvements and methods we come upon along the way. I'll continue in a moment. What's interesting here, it doesn't sound particularly controversial, but I think a lot of modal epistemology has been very prescriptive rather than descriptive. It's been sort of concerned with how sort of an ideal epistemic subject might come to have justified true modal beliefs or even modal knowledge. What Daniel Nolan suggests here is a more descriptive approach, one that looks what we actually do, not what somebody could be doing, but what we human beings are actually doing when we think about modality. And of course, not in the cases where it goes badly, because there is a prescriptive element in the end. So in the cases where we think it goes well. And so that's something I'm going to take very seriously. I think an interesting modal epistemology, or at least the kind of modal epistemology I'm interested in, is going to have this descriptive element. It's trying to figure out how we human beings actually modalize, think and know about modality. So, and then how do we investigate this? Here's where the naturalized really comes into full force. Daniel Nolan suggests a kind of methodological naturalism where we not only advocate our actual modalizing, but we do that naturalistically. And to do that naturalistically, we should use scientific techniques and techniques analogous to scientific techniques to investigate what we're doing already. So the way in which we're being naturalist here and the way in which science comes in is not just, and in fact, that's not going to come in at all in what I'm doing, thinking about how scientists modalize. That's clearly that can be part of this kind of project, but it's not actually what I'll be interested in. It's more what scientists have found out about we ordinary human beings modalize. And that's the kind of naturalizing, that's going to be one naturalizing element of what I'll be suggesting. Now, where do we look for that? What kind of science might be relevant? Well, that really depends. As Daniel Nolan also points out, and after that I will stop quoting him and do my own thing, he says our modal opinions carry across a wide area, not just explicit judgments of metaphysical possibility and impossibility, but judgments about the truth of counterfactual and other conditional claims, judgments of feasibility and ability, judgments about dispositions, powers, and chances. Now, if you know me philosophically, you will expect that I jumped at this final bit, and that's actually the bit I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on modal judgments that haven't received a lot of attention in the modal epistemology literature, judgments about feasibility and ability, dispositions and powers, and ability in particular. But before I do that, I'm going to try and convince you that this might be interesting to you as a metaphysician of science, and not just if you're already interested in modal epistemology. So the talk comes in two parts, which are actually separate papers, and I put these papers together in the hope that at least one of them might be interesting to most of you, and I hope they work together. I've never put them together like this before. So in the first part, I'm actually not going to do modal epistemology yet, but I'm going to offer some very general sort of methodological considerations about what happens when we think about metaphysical modality. And that's where I think the metaphysician of science, or at least some metaphysicians of science, will sort of be interested in this for actual metaphysical reasons. And I will try and convince you that in order to get these sort of methodological issues sorted out, modal epistemology of the descriptive type that I've identified from the Daniel Nolan quote matters. And then in part two, I will sketch the first steps of a kind of modal epistemology that I find highly attractive, that I think deserves the title naturalized, although it also involves quite a bit of genuinely philosophical theorizing, and that has, once it's properly spelled out, and as I said, this is, for me, this is a project that's in relatively early stages, but that will have, I think, when it's properly spelled out, some implications for the methodological issues I've pointed out in part 1, and hence indirectly for the metaphysics of science. Okay, so slightly complicated dialectic, but we'll get through it. Okay, so I want to convince you that modal epistemology, or certain questions of modal epistemology, matter for questions in the metaphysics of science. And I want to start by considering some methodological questions about what we're talking about when we're talking about metaphysical modality. Now, metaphysical modality, in fact, in the talks I've been to at this conference so far, metaphysical modality has come up quite a few times. I think thinking about metaphysical modality is very often one of the tools that the metaphysician of science uses. And there's sort of a very, the way in which it's come up quite a lot here, and I think that's representative for metaphysics of science, is in asking questions about how metaphysical possibility relates to physical or nomological or natural possibility. I find these questions very, very tricky and difficult, but also in a way sort of methodologically interesting, because metaphysical modality is this sort of weird philosophical concept that we don't really have before we do philosophy. We have all sorts of modal concepts before we do philosophy, but not really one of metaphysical modality. That sets it apart from a lot of other interesting concepts in philosophy. For instance, when we debate knowledge, we can have deep disagreements about the nature of knowledge. We can be internalists, externalists, all kinds of things, but we tend to agree on sort of, well, unless we're skeptics, of course. If we're not skeptics, we tend to agree on sort of the extent of the phenomenon. And either way, we can bring some grip of what we're talking about from ordinary life. When it comes to metaphysical modality, there are deep disagreements, not just about its nature. What kind of thing is it? Is it something real, natural? Is it something mind-dependent? We have deep disagreements about its grounds that can range all the way from language to essences of objects, or in my preferred view, dispositions of objects. But we also have very deep disagreements about the extent of metaphysical modality, what qualifies as a metaphysical possibility in the first place. Now, of course, we agree on lots of metaphysical possibilities, but we do have, there is one very interesting and important disagreement that's come up in various talks today and yesterday, and that's, as I said, the debate about the relation between metaphysical and natural, physical, nomological modality. And my sort of sociological, but just anecdotal observation is that when you talk to sort of most mainstream metaphysicians, people not really working in the metaphysics of science, they take it as a given that metaphysical possibility ought to be wider or to include more possibilities than physical possibility. They're often aware that there are some arguments to the contrary, but that seems to be kind of the default stance. We distinguish between these two things. I think among the metaphysicians of science, there's more of a tendency, probably due to a lot of interesting work in the metaphysics of science, towards necessitarianism, the idea that the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary, or in other words, that physical, nomological, natural possibility and metaphysical possibility coincide. Now, that's an interesting disagreement, but in order to settle it, we need to make sure that we're not just talking past each other, that there's a common phenomenon that we're disagreeing about, which deserves the name metaphysical possibility. And I think unlike some cases like knowledge, where we have this ordinary grip, it's not that clear with metaphysical possibility that we do actually know we're all talking about the same thing. Okay, so, metaphysical modality, I think, is a philosophical term of art. We have no pre-theoretical intuitions to appeal to talk about it as opposed to other types of modality. We do, again, of course, have a lot of pre-theoretical views about all sorts of types of modality. So I think what happens very often, although that happens implicitly, is that we approach it from other types of modality that we feel we understand better or more directly. And these can be of different kinds. So a typical picture that you'd get from the mainstream metaphysician who doesn't like necessitarianism is that metaphysical possibility is sort of wedged between these other types of modalities, some of which we have a better grip on. they're sort of so I'm representing the possibilities. If I was representing the necessities, the sizes would be reversed, but I'm just going to go with the possibilities. So there is the sort of widest sense of possibility, the logical possibilities. Some people like to think instead about something more epistemological, conceivability, and that includes all sorts of things that people tend to think aren't metaphysically possible, like my having had different parents, or perhaps even less controversially, water not being H2O. And then there's the inner circle, which is something like ordinary possibility. I'm sorry, I should have exchanged the example, which comes from earlier talk in pre-pandemic times. I could have walked here from the station, because I didn't come here from the station. I could have walked here from home. And metaphysical possibility is supposed to be weighted somewhere between these two things. That much I think most of us can agree on. It's supposed to be more general than ordinary possibilities, but somehow less expansive than the logical possibilities. But I think that gives us sort of two ways to get a fix on what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about metaphysical modality. One way to approach it is to start with the wider possibility, the logical possibilities, and find some way of restricting them to something that's properly metaphysical. So we start with something very general and we restrict it to something sort of more worldly, as it were. The other way of doing it is to start with the ordinary possibilities and try and extend or expand them to something. So here we have got something very worldly, and we try to expand it into something that's sort of general enough to count as metaphysical. Whoops, sorry. This lines up nicely with an observation in modal epistemology made by Anand Vaidya and Michi Weiner, who distinguish two questions in modal epistemology. They say the access question asks, how is it that we gain access to or acquire epistemic standing for beliefs about modality, such as that it's possible for X to be F? That sort of, how do we get into modal thinking in the first place? And we can do that from logic, that's sort of from the outside, or we can do it from ordinary life, that's from the small circle. The navigation question then asks, how can we reason with justification from one kind of modality to another, say from logical to metaphysical to physical, or of course the other way around. And so I think there are two questions depending on how you answer the access question. There are two approaches in trying to get a fix on metaphysical modality, depending on how you answer the access question. The one way of answering the question is we get access through a sort of grid of logical possibilities. We start with that, and then we restrict it to get to metaphysical possibility. Now, if you're thinking of this in modal epistemology, it tends to come with a roughly a priori based modal epistemology, because that's how we know about logic, and then you just add some stuff to it, typically something more linguistic like rigid designation, and then that restricts you the kinds of possible scenarios you think about. But you might also add something a bit more metaphysical. But as it were, the default status for any logically consistent proposition would be possibility, but you sort of restrict that the possibilities to those that somehow sort of connect in the right way to the world. So that's one way of thinking about metaphysical possibilities. And the other way, as I said, is by starting with the more ordinary possibilities and then start to generalize from there until you get to something that you're willing to call metaphysical possibility. Now, I think that procedure leaves it very much open what the extent of metaphysical possibility is going to be. It just depends on sort of what, as it were, how you answer the navigation question, sort of how you do the extending. That's going to determine at least partly where the extending is going to end. And if you think of metaphysical possibility in this way, you're more likely, I think these aren't entailments, they're just sort of tendencies, you're more likely to adopt sort of more what people now call empiricist modal epistemology, one that thinks of our modal knowledge as continuous with sort of everyday knowledge that we have. Now, I just want to stress that the distinction I'm drawing isn't one about metaphysical views. It's not even really one about epistemological views. It's really more one about how do you answer the question, what the hell are you talking about when you say metaphysical modality? It's sort of trying to get a fix on the phenomenon we're talking about. But my hypothesis is that how you get a fix on the phenomenon is going to influence how you think about its metaphysics and its epistemology. And in particular, to come back to the question I started with, I think this kind of picture, the extension picture, is much friendlier to the kind of necessitarian view, because it starts with a smaller set of possibilities, and any kind of extension has to sort of, be justified. And I think we do want to extend, but it seems to me a lot friendlier to ending up with an extent of metaphysical possibility that doesn't go beyond the physical possibilities. Again, that's all just tendencies. Okay, now, so one thing I just want to point out here, that's not actually very relevant to modal epistemology, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Well, I think it's important when we discuss metaphysical modality. I think it's not at all clear that these two ways of getting a fix on the phenomenon are actually getting a fix on the same phenomenon. So it may very well be that metaphysicians sometimes talk past each other when they disagree about the extent of metaphysical modality. This is something I've come to think partly because I've been met with so many incredulous stares by people when I presented my own theory of modality, which very clearly sort of belongs into this camp and imposes boundaries on what's metaphysically possible. And then people say, yeah, but it's conceivable. And I'd say, yeah, but that doesn't matter. And so I think this has something to do with sort of where we're coming from when we're thinking about metaphysical modality. When you look at sort of the beginnings of the contemporary debate on metaphysical modality and Kripke's naming of necessity, I think he uses both, and at least you can find sort of evidence for both in him. But my suspicion is that these two things may not end up getting us a fix on the same phenomenon. So I want to focus on this kind of approach, which I think is friendlier to the metaphysician of science, who also has some sympathies for something like necessitarianism about the laws. And so I want to think a little bit further about it. One reason I like it, apart from the fact that it works better for my own view of metaphysical modality, is that I think there's some evidence that this is how, in general, we think about modality. We tend to start with a sort of narrower notion, with a narrower set of possibilities, and expand from there, as evidenced by some really fun to read studies from developmental psychology. So this is Andrew Stulman and Susan Carey. They did studies with children and found that, and presented them with different types of events, asked them to judge if those events could happen in real life, and found that if these events were ordinary, children, whether they were 4 or 6 or 8, gave the same judgment as adults, namely that they were possible. If these events were something that, what they call impossible, quite close to metaphysically impossible, although some of them were maybe primarily physically impossible, like eating lightning for dinner, children from the age of 4 onwards agreed with adults that these were impossible. But with events that they call improbable, but they're really more like atypical, not a close by possibility, finding an alligator under the bed, for instance, most of the 4-year-olds actually judged these to be impossible, and only sort of even the 8-year-olds still largely judged them impossible. And it's only the adults that sort of saw that these were just as possible as more ordinary events. That seems to me evidence, of course, not about how philosophers talk about metaphysical modality, but that the sort of natural move in the human mind is that we start with a more restricted set of possibilities and then somehow manage to expand our conception of possibility to cover things that are very unlikely, but still possible. I'll come back to this study again. Now, I think this sort of conception I've suggested fits quite nicely with what people sometimes say about metaphysical possibility, or metaphysical modality, namely that it's absolute modality or the most general objective modality. And I think can deal very well with the objective bit, because that's what we start with in ordinary life, but it has some trouble sort of getting the most general quite right. That's the sort of extending bit. And in fact, I said this is more congenial to the philosopher who would like to keep the realm of possibilities a bit narrower, and maybe just keep them to the physical possibilities. But in fact, there is a challenge to this kind of view, which Justin Clark-Doane, for instance, has argued, that it's very unclear sort of where to stop. I mean, that's not quite how he phrases it, but sort of in my framework, I think that's how to phrase it. It's very unclear why should anything less than logical possibility really be the most general version of what we've started with. So in a nutshell, if I'm right about this sort of extension picture, how do we get a handle on the extension and where does it stop? My hypothesis, the hypothesis I would like to suggest is that a good way of sort of dealing with that kind of challenge is to treat our modal vocabulary a bit like Kripkean natural kind terms. So, which is not necessarily to subscribe to the view that metaphysical modality is a natural kind. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that kind of semantics can be applied to things that aren't natural kinds in a sort of very strong sense. There's a nice paper by Christian Nimtz, for instance, where he generalizes the sort of mechanism and just calls that paradigm terms. So we have certain terms that get introduced into, well, that we can think of as introduced into the language by starting with paradigmatic examples and saying, well, everything that's like these examples in the right kind of way falls under the term. I think that happens quite a lot, whether or not we have a natural kind in the strict sense. And I suggest that a good way of thinking about this sort of extension method is to treat metaphysical modality as that kind of term. We start with paradigmatic examples, and then we say everything that's relevantly like this, that's going to be a possibility. And so in a sense, we can't determine the extension of metaphysically possible before we've settled something about the metaphysics of our paradigmatic examples. So it really matters what the paradigmatic examples are going to be. So where do we start? I suggest the paradigmatic examples must be sort of in the smaller set of ordinary possibilities, but it's very unclear exactly what belongs in there. It's probably going to be pretty fuzzy. Natural language modals are notoriously context sensitive. They cover all kinds of different ways of thinking about modality. So what do we start with? In order to get a handle on this, I suggest we just repeat the same thing within ordinary modality and find out what it really sort of, where does modal thought, where do modal concepts really start? So we identify, as it were, the core, the paradigmatic examples for ordinary modal thought itself, and think of ordinary modals as having this same structure, whatever it is like the initial examples that we started with. And again, I think this fits very nicely with the idea that we start with a narrow set of possibilities and expand from there. So here's my double hypothesis. We can treat our modal vocabulary much like Kripkean natural kind terms, or paradigm terms. Their extension gets fixed by paradigm cases and the right kind of relation to them, everything of the same kind. And to identify the paradigm cases, we should look at what gets us started in thinking about modality at all. So we should take really seriously what I've called with Badja and Warner, the access question. The question, how do we start to think about modality in the first place? How do we get access into the modal realm? And my suggestion, since I'm doing the sort of extension story and not the restriction story, is that it's with ordinary, very simple kind of ordinary modals and not with something like logic. Okay, so that was my long-winded justification for exposing you to modal epistemology of the sort of descriptive kind that looks at how we actually modalize, and in particular at an approach to modal epistemology that really looks at how we start thinking about modality, how we gain access into modality. So this is sort of my project, and that's going to be my project for quite some time. I think it's a book-length project, thinking about modal epistemology in this way, by first sort of locating our entry, our access into the modal realm and seeing, so giving a cognitively and scientifically plausible story of how we get in there and then how we navigate once we're in. So this is where we get to the second part of the talk, first steps towards a naturalized modal epistemology. Here we go. So how do we start if we want to have a descriptively plausible view of how we begin with our modal thought? Well, I take a hint, I take a hint from the philosophy of perception, where Susanna Siegel has, I think, helpfully distinguished between two approaches. One is the spectator-first approach, which foregrounds the role of the perceiver as an observer, and here the paradigmatic perceptions are observations of scenes with which one does not necessarily interact, such as watching a sunset. And I think that's been sort of the paradigm of perception in sort of long periods in the history of philosophy. More recently, an action-first approach to visual perception has come more to the forefront, which foregrounds the role of the perceiver as an actor. So we think about perception as something that's embedded in our engagement with the world, and the paradigmatic perceptions here are byproducts of action plans. So people who think about perception in this way will very often think about our perceptions as, I mean, not necessarily, but as something like, you know, if you want to get a cup of coffee, you move around the kitchen and you see, for instance, that there's a mug and that you can take it, and that you see the coffee as something you can drink, and so on. So people here will often talk about action properties or affordances as the content of our perception. And one argument that is given for a kind of action-first approach to to philosophy of perception, to theories of perception, is that it's a much more plausible story, for instance, about how modal cognition developed, because we are first and foremost beings that act in the world and not beings that observe the world. I just realized that I can't actually see the time on my computer. I'll just very briefly start. Yeah, okay, I'm fine, thanks. Sorry, I'll just continue. Okay. So my suggestion for modal epistemology is that if it's going to be, you know, naturalistically plausible, then we might try taking an action-first approach to modal epistemology as well, and think about the kind of modal knowledge that's relevant for our being agents in the world, and that's sort of related to action plans, or just the various ways we act. How could we do that? Well, I think probably the most prominent approach in modal epistemology that can claim to be action first would be something like the counterfactual approach that's been made most popular by Tim Williamson, but also used by a number of other people, for instance, Thomas Krödel. Now, I don't want to go that route, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why before I go into the route that I do want to take. So according to people like Williamson and Krödel, when we think about modal knowledge as something that's sort of closely related to our engagement with the world, that has an evolutionary history and explanation and so on, counterfactual conditionals are going to be really good because on the one hand, they're extremely useful for survival. They help you learn from experience and so on. And on the other hand, you can actually use whatever ways we have of knowing about these counterfactuals to find out about metaphysical modality. Famously, Tim Williamson uses the equivalences between necessarily P and various formulations you can give with counterfactuals. For instance, if not P, then contradiction, or for all Q, if Q, then P, with the if then being a counterfactual conditional. And then that takes you straight to metaphysical modality. But the thought is that the capacity for counterfactual reasoning is something that's sort of very deeply ingrained in real life, in action, in sort of our evolutionary development. And, you know, I think there's a place for counterfactual thought, but for various reasons, I don't think that's how modal thought gets started. So I don't think it's an answer to the access question. First piece of evidence, there's a number of studies from sort of somewhere between psychology and linguistics, but mostly done in psychology, which seems to show that children have serious difficulties with properly counterfactual thought. So the main people doing this are Eva Raffetseder and Josef Perner. Sorry for pronouncing these in such a German way, but they're German names. And they've done a lot of studies with kids where it turns out that these children seem to evaluate counterfactual. Sorry, I should say, these people know quite well about the semantics of counterfactuals that are being given in linguistics and philosophy. And in their studies, they show that adults, even without having studied any linguistics or philosophy, tend to use the sort of Lewis-Stormaker framework or something that conforms to that framework, which is when they think about whether if P had been the case, Q had been the case, they sort of consider the closest possible world, or they sort of, as it were, drop only those bits of knowledge about the world they have that are incompatible with P. So they consider the closest possible world where P, the possible world, which is just like ours, except that P. Children don't do that. If children are asked to consider a counterfactual supposition, what if P were the case, they drop everything they know and go to a kind of normal or generic world. At least that's what comes out in these studies. The authors call it basic conditional reasoning. And they argue that this is what most children do actually sort of throughout primary school age. So real counterfactual thought in the way that we philosophers like it actually only starts sort of when kids are sort of, well, I think it changes sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's something more like 12. Personally, I find these things really difficult because I think my son handles counterfactuals and he's only 8, but then he's a philosopher's child and that's only anecdotal. There seems to be good empirical evidence that the kind of counterfactual reasoning that we philosophers like and that is employed in these kinds of modal epistemologies sets in rather late. And I think there's a lot of modal thought before that, which then probably has a different source. Now, I'll be honest, there is some criticism of this, of course. Some people argue that it's really a problem about the linguistic constructions and not the kind of thought behind it. I haven't seen these criticisms spelled out enough to quite convince me. I also think that basic conditional reasoning, it looks a lot like thinking about generics instead of counterfactuals. And I think there's other evidence that children sort of naturally think in terms of generics. So it makes sense, but obviously this is empirical evidence and it can be called into question. But I think it's one reason not to start with counterfactuals if we're trying to answer the access question. On the other hand, the kind of modal thinking I want to focus on and will focus on in a moment, such as the abilities of agents, the affordances of objects around us, my ability to hold this glass, the drinkability of this water and so on. Here again, looking at sort of admittedly linguistic evidence, the modal we use to express this can is by far the most common modal. If you can see, it has like among the adults, it has over 5,000 uses. Among the children in this particular study, 2,000. No other modal comes even close, and it's almost always used in the root sense, which is the objective sense, not the epistemic sense. And I'm just not aware of any evidence that children have problems using it correctly. Although, of course, children can be wrong about their own abilities, but they seem to be much more competent much earlier on with this kind of construction. Now, this is all linguistic. I'll have some non-linguistic evidence in a moment. Finally, whoops, here we are. Finally, a third consideration is purely philosophical. I think counterfactuals aren't a very good answer to the access question because, of course, they don't get us started with possibilities. As everybody, including Tim Williamson and Thomas Krödel, agree, a counterfactual by itself, if P were the case, then Q would be the case, doesn't give us any evidence of possibilities unless we supplement it with the possibility of its antecedent. Or we do weird things like putting in contradictions, but that's very unlikely to be at the beginning of modal thought. So it seems that even if we can use counterfactuals to extend our modal knowledge, so it's going to come in for the navigation question, counterfactuals are an unlikely candidate for an answer to the access question for how we get started on modal thought in the first place. Instead, I think, and now here it gets purely philosophical, instead I think we should turn directly to the theory, to thinking about actions themselves and the kinds of preconditions that they come with. And in particular, I want to argue for the following claim: to act in the ways that we do, we human beings, we must have knowledge of our own abilities. And given that we act in the ways we do pretty early on in life, it seems knowledge of our own abilities is a sort of pretty early kind of knowledge. And since it's a kind of modal knowledge, I think it has a much better claim for being one of the sources, at least, of our modal knowledge and one of the answers to the access question. And I'll specify all this a little bit more in what follows. It also goes very nicely, of course, with the linguistic evidence that the modal can, which paradigmatically expresses ability, is sort of early and quite common. Okay. So how does my argument work? And admittedly, this is not very naturalistic. It's a purely action theoretic argument, but I think modal epistemology will benefit from thinking a little bit about the theory of action, especially if it's going to be action first. So how do I proceed? Well, I will think of knowledge as non-accidentally true belief, and some sort of non-accidentally true belief is going to be knowledge. And so first I will argue that in order to act in the ways we do, we must have beliefs about our own abilities. Then I'm going to argue that those beliefs are going to be largely non-accidentally true. And finally, I will defend the idea that these non-accidentally true beliefs must really have abilities as their content and not something else. All of this is going to be a bit sketchy. There's a much longer paper, which I'm happy to give details about in the discussion. Okay, first step, belief. If we act in any way at all, think about a very simple action, cycling to the office, drinking some water. We generally exercise some of our abilities. Obviously, in cycling to work, I'm exercising my ability to cycle. In drinking from my glass of water, I'm exercising all kinds of motor abilities. But our abilities are limited. There are some things I can do and other things I can't do. I can cycle to work, but I can't drive. I'm just, I think I took a test like when I was 18. I've never done it since. I'm pretty sure I've lost the ability to drive a car. That's one of the reasons I cycle to work, because that's something I actually have the ability to do. I can grasp a glass, put it to my mouth, bring it in the right position and swallow the water. That I can do. I can't extend my lips and sort of just drink the water from over there. That's just not an ability I have. Now, that's a ridiculous ability, but still it's one that I'm I'm not explicitly aware I don't have, but I know it in just the way that I'm aware of other opportunities and constraints for my actions. So, you might think, I might say I'm cycling to work because I have a bike, but I don't have a car. And that kind of knowledge guides my choices in getting to the office. In the same way, knowing that I have the ability to cycle, but I don't have the ability to drive, will also guide my actions in getting to work. So in acting, we exercise our abilities. Our abilities are limited. And in order to sort of pursue a goal in a sort of not just haphazard trial and error way, we need to have some way of picking the options that we have an ability to take. And we're pretty good at that. We don't generally try to do ridiculous things that we're unable to do. I'm not saying we have perfect knowledge of our own abilities, but if we didn't have any knowledge about our abilities at all, we would not be acting in the ways we do. Now, I said we need to have some way of picking the options. Does that way have to be a belief? Well, at least if the actions we're thinking about are intentional actions, that's a favorite topic of philosophers of action, and belief is the thing which guides intentional action, that's, I think, also something people can agree on, well, the cognitive state of certain description which guides intentional actions, then I think beliefs about abilities have exactly this, our ways of selecting abilities have exactly this. I'll do it again. Then whatever access we have to our own abilities has exactly the status as other kinds of things which are clearly recognizable as beliefs which guide our intentional actions. And here again, when you ask me, why did you take the bike and not the car? And I say, because the car is broken, I'm articulating a belief that guided my intentional action. If you ask me, why did you take the bike and not the car? And I say, because I can ride a bike, but I can't drive a car. I'm articulating a belief which guided my action in just the same way. And I'm suggesting that's typical of the way in which sort of we seem to be aware of our own abilities and their limits. Now, when we go below intentional action to something a bit less demanding, philosophers of action tend to reserve the term intentional for actions that we can be responsible for, sort of goal-directed actions. Then sort of whether we still want to call these ways of selecting between what we have and don't have abilities for, if you still want to call those beliefs, depends on how demanding your notion of belief is. But some sort of representation, I think, is going on even there. Okay, so next step, truth. I've argued very briefly that our actions are guided by beliefs about our own abilities. Now, if those beliefs weren't mostly true, but instead mostly false, we'd be exposed to massive failures in our actions. As I said, we'd be sort of, we might have beliefs and confidently take a particular route, but, you know, just fail and have to try something else. We'd still be sort of caught in some sort of trial and error. Or especially if we had all kinds of false beliefs about such that, massively false positive ability beliefs of the form I can fly, where that's just false. If we had loads of them, we would just fail in our actions all the time. And now I don't, dispute that we fail in a lot of things, but most of our everyday actions are pretty successful. Just think about, getting up in the morning, putting on your clothes, having breakfast and that kind of thing. All of that, those are actions that are guided by your ability beliefs, and those beliefs tend to be largely true, or you wouldn't be here. If, on the other hand, we had a lot of false negative ability beliefs, lots of beliefs that we can't fly, when in fact we can, I think that's a bit trickier, but I think if there were too many of those, we'd end up in a sort of state of inertia, because we wouldn't even sort of try lots of things that we can actually do. Now, we're not exposed to massive failure, we're not exposed to massive inertia, although there may be lots of abilities that we don't know we have, but, we seem to sort of be getting it right quite a bit. And so I'm saying that at least a lot of our ability beliefs are going to be true. And now the last step towards knowledge, true beliefs are one thing, knowledge is another. But if we think of knowledge as just the kind of non-accidentally true beliefs that externalists tend to take them to be, and then you can spell that out in different ways. Non-accidentally true means safe or produced by reliable mechanisms or something like that. If you think of knowledge in such a way, then I think the fact that we don't just succeed with the actions guided by ability beliefs, but reliably and safely succeed with them, gives us reason to believe that the guiding ability beliefs are also safely, reliably, and non-accidentally true. Feel free to ask me about more details here. I'll be happy to give some. So I think we have reason to believe that our actions are guided by non-accidentally true beliefs about our own abilities. And so given that we act a lot in the world very early on in life, we have reason to believe that very early on in life, we have a lot of non-accidentally true beliefs about our own abilities. Does it really have to be abilities, and what kind of abilities am I talking about? So one thing that's important to me is that I'm really talking about abilities, not just possibilities. Possibilities are far too weak to guide our actions. Also, it's possible that I drive a car, but I don't have the ability. So we need something a bit more robust than a mere possibility. It's a real ability. Also, it needs to be what's often called general abilities, the kinds of abilities that you retain. So it's not just my ability to ride this bike right in, well, obviously, assuming there's a bike in front of me, to ride this bike right here, right now. That's sometimes called a specific ability. It's quite useful to know about those things as well. But I think it's highly implausible that we know just about those things. Why is that? Well, for one thing, that's the kind of thing that you learn about maybe on one occasion. And then as soon as the situation changes, it completely loses its value. But it seems that we have sort of the beliefs that guide our actions tend to be about something a bit more stable, something that we can take from one situation into the next. So if we just had knowledge about sort of what we can do right here, right now in exactly that situation, it would be sort of miraculous how we kept coming up with that kind of knowledge. It seems a much more plausible hypothesis that we have knowledge of the kinds of general abilities, like my ability to ride a bike, which I'm taking with me wherever I go. And that's something that I learn about once, and then I can sort of keep using that in different situations. Moreover, if we think about our actions as not just something that's done on the spot, but as something that's done over time that comes with plans, recall the idea of action plans in the Susanna Siegel quote. So then lots of our actions are actually such that we pick options without knowing the exact situation. So one of my action plans is to get home before 8 p.m. tonight. So I'm in Germany, it's sort of 7 p.m. now, towards 7 p.m. Let's see if I'll make it, but I have a plan to be home by 8 p.m. And you know, that relies on my ability to ride my bike because my bike is out there. But I don't know exactly what the situation will be. I don't know, you know, how many cars there will be on the street and so on and so forth. And there are, of course, much longer action plans. I have a plan to write a book. That's going to take me several years. In pursuing that plan, I need to rely on my abilities, but I really have no idea. I think we've all learned that over the past 2 years. It's very difficult to find out what the situation is going to be in a few months' time. So I think we need to know about abilities, not just possibilities, and we need to know about our general abilities, something that's based in our intrinsic properties, in fact, that I think is an intrinsic modal property of the agent. Moreover, I think the kind of knowledge we need to guide our actions needs to be abilities, really abilities, not something else, such as conditionals, and the reason is something we've already seen. Conditionals are not just unsuited to play the role of answering the access question to modality for the same reason. They're not enough to guide our actions. I can know all kinds of conditionals, counterfactual or otherwise. If I don't know if I have the ability to make the antecedent true, then those counterfactuals aren't going to help me pick an option that I'm able to actually make true. So even if conditionals do come in quite handy in planning and executing our actions, we need to have some knowledge of what we can do prior to that. That sort of is independent of our knowledge of counterfactuals and might be put in the antecedent of conditionals or counterfactual conditionals that we know about. Okay, now I promised you a naturalized modal epistemology. Do I still have time? Let me see. Well, I'll be quick. Now, how early is that knowledge of abilities, which I've argued we must have, how early is that going to be? And here I found it striking. I mean, I haven't told you where that knowledge comes from. My suspicion is that knowledge of our own abilities is not just needed for actions, it's also gained in our own actions. That sounds a bit circular, but I don't think it is. I think we gain some knowledge of our own abilities, which then feeds into new actions, which provide us with new knowledge of abilities, because in every action we exercise a whole lot of abilities. And I think that's closely related to sort of feeling ourselves to be the agents of our own actions, because that's when we can conclude we've got an ability. Now, so that's just a hypothesis. I think knowledge of abilities comes about in much the same way as knowledge of dispositions. You sort of see the exercise, and in the right kinds of conditions, you tend to infer that there's a stable intrinsic property responsible for it. Anyway, how early is knowledge of abilities likely to be? And here I think it's quite interesting, again, to look at developmental psychology, or at least I've been enjoying this very much, so I'm hoping it's relevant. People used to think that infants didn't have a lot of knowledge about the world. Well, a bit more recently, I think since the 1970s, the paradigm has shifted a little bit in developmental psychology, and now the tendency seems to be to attribute a lot of cognitive states to infants. And I think the most famous of these is the idea that actually, basically, 2-month-olds already have a pretty rich conception of objects that can persist even if you don't see them for a little bit, and that interact with each other in certain ways. But another area that has been studied quite a lot is infants' conception of agency. There's the famous experiment, if you've never seen it, it's a lot of fun, where you've got a mobile above the crib and then you attach the mobile with the string to the infant's leg, such that the infant, if they move that leg, will move the mobile as well. And once they've figured that out, they just don't stop. They completely neglect the other leg and they get so happy. And that's been taken to be evidence that they have some experience of their own agency. They seem to recognize agency in others as well. In fact, they seem to categorize, that's my third point, things they encounter into agents and patients, and observe and they're sort of more surprised if something that they've categorized as an agent, in particular as animate, they categorize things into agents and patients, which roughly corresponds to animate and non-animate, and then they're much more surprised when they're not surprised when the animate thing moves by itself. They're very surprised when the non-animate thing moves by itself. And there's all sorts of things that these psychologists have found out. And what I found particularly striking is that even newborns seem to be able to map the action they observe in a grown-up to their own actions. So I think the famous bit is if you stick out your tongue at a newborn, the newborn's going to stick out their tongue too. And that seems to be more than a reflex, because if you stick out your tongue to the side, the newborn is also going to try to stick out their tongue to the side, and if they don't succeed immediately, they'll try again. And if they see you again the next day, though I think that's not quite true of newborns, they will stick out their tongue again, which seems to show that they have not just sort of, they react to something that looks like an intentional action, and they have a way of mapping that onto their own movements and onto sort of proprioceptive evidence of whether they're getting it right. So Susan Carey, who's a very, who's sort of one of the grand dames of developmental psychology, concludes that very young infants track the ontological status and causal dispositions, that made me very happy, of the participants in causal interactions, and they use this information to inform their interpretation of the causal interaction they're observing. So this is about observing, but they seem to be able to map it onto themselves, which to me suggests that infants have, in some sense, of course not sort of in the explicit ways we grown-ups have, but they seem to have a lot of what it takes to recognize their own abilities. They seem to have a sense of their own agency. They can characterize others into agents and patients. They can map what they see in others onto themselves. It seems to me they have a lot of what it takes to recognize their own abilities in some way or another. And if it's not infants, it's going to be young children who clearly seem to have goal-directed agency and some way of recognizing it in themselves. So whatever exactly we think about this evidence, I think we have good reason to believe that knowledge of our own agency is something that happens really early on in human life, much earlier than counterfactual thought, for instance. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us at the beginning of a project. I think we've identified an area for access into the modal realm, an area that's action first, and that gives us one of the paradigmatic modal phenomena, namely abilities. I think a similar case could be made for other kinds of modal properties involved in action, like the affordances of the things around us, the graspability of the cup, the drinkability of the water, the rattleability of a rattle, if we're going back to infants. And probably even, given what social animals we are, abilities of other agents, not just ourselves. I think that was already implicit in the kind of evidence about causal interactions, if you take that seriously. Now, if that's right, that leaves us with a number of interesting empirical questions, namely, can we really ascribe to children, and at what age can we really ascribe to children something like a concept of their own abilities, and at which stage is that something we philosophers would like to call knowledge? That's the less empirical question. What else is there? I've argued for knowledge of our own abilities. Clearly, there's more. I've mentioned affordances. Infants also seem to have a pretty good perception of risk. They don't climb on a visual cliff. And of course, if I'm right that this is how we gain access into the modal realm, that kind of access is tied up with all sorts of other things which we philosophers want to separate out from the modal. There's causation, there's intentionality in the sort of goal-directedness of agency. There's all sorts of stuff going on. When and how does that sort of get separated from each other such that we might attribute to the children something like a concept of possibility, which is distinct from a concept of, say, causation or agency? Or it might even be de dicto, which is something that I think isn't present at all here. So I think these are questions that will have the philosophers fruitfully interact with science, with scientists, though not so much the natural scientists, more the psychologists. And then, of course, there's a lot of philosophical questions that will be important, namely, what is the underlying nature of those paradigmatic modal phenomena that we've identified in the context of agency? And I suggest, well, perhaps unsurprisingly to those of you who know my views in metaphysics, they're modal properties of objects, and how far can we generalize from them by expanding, extending, as I've argued we should. But I think that really depends on our answer to the first question. How do we get to the dicto modality? Do we get beyond physical possibility? I hope I haven't promised you an answer to that, because I can't give you one yet. As I said, this is the beginning of a research project. What I'm hoping to have convinced you of is that this is an interesting and hopefully fruitful research program that deserves further study and interestingly links philosophy to empirical science. These are the references, just in case anybody wanted to look any of them up. And thank you so much for your patience. I think I've gone over time a little bit. Thank you.